Hey everybody, welcome to my weekly podcast, The House List. Yes, you're on the house list. I just marked your name off with a big freaking marker. I see you have a +1. Is that person here with you right now? Oh no, they're coming later. Oh, why don't you just give me their name and I can write it down over here, and then they can just tell me, oh, I'm on the house list when they arrive later. And they'll be escorted to the area in which we've sanctioned off for you. And then they too, just like you, and many others like you, can enjoy this episode that I put together for you. If this is your first time tuning in, I guess, if you will, yes, my name is Peter Agoston, and this is my weekly podcast called The House List. It's a music industry, for a lack of a better word, based conversational podcast. There you go. And my guest today is a very special one. She's a great friend of mine, an old friend of mine that I've known for a long time and I've worked with many, many times. Michelle Cable of Panache Booking, of Panache Magazine. If some of you know her from back then you'll be excited to know that I've decided to make our conversation into a 2-part episode. So I'm going to close out 2016 and this season of The House List with a great conversation with Michelle Cable that went like 3 hours plus. It was so good and detailed that I'm going to also start the new year off, 2017, in a premiere of the all-new season of The House List with a continuation of my conversation with Michelle Cable. So I'm pretty excited about that. I wasn't anticipating it to go long, so it was actually done over the course of 2 days because we just had a lot to talk about. We worked together on a lot. I was a booking agent at Panache Booking for 3 or 4 years. I helped write and distribute Panache Magazine, which was the fanzine, music, sort of art, alternative like zine that the booking agency was birthed from back in Humboldt County, California, in Northern California, in Eureka, Arcata, Fortuna, etc. So since Michelle and I go so far back, we just spent the first hour really talking about her growing up, moving to California, the origin of Panache Magazine and the local shows in Humboldt County that existed to support the magazine, basically like benefit shows and magazine release parties. I met Michelle, I think, when she was 16. So she had started it back then when she was in high school, working at the mall at Orange Julius and editing and doing the whole layout and like on this big ass primitive computer. This was not even that long ago, but I guess it was in a way. It was probably, I think I met her in 2000 or 2001 for sure. We've been friends and working together ever since and collaborated in a lot of ways. So if you are a fan or familiar or even work with Michelle, I think you're really going to dig this conversation that we had. If you may be unfamiliar with her, I'll kind of break it down a little bit. So Michelle runs and operates a booking agency, which is now based in Los Angeles. It started in basically Humboldt County, Northern California, shifted to San Francisco, then expanded to New York, where it kind of blew up in a way, if you will, I guess for lack of a better term. That's when I was working there, along with Jesse Hodges and a slew of other people and lots of interns and stuff. And then just recently, she shut down the New York office and is full-time in LA. So if you know artists like Demarco, which at this point in time I think a lot of people probably do, Segall, the OCs, Jonathan Tubin, who's a great New York-based DJ, Michael Cronin, and even some of the older wave of Panache bands like RTX and a ton. I don't want to sit here and just toss a bunch of names at you, but I think that you will really appreciate this. It's really cool. It's a great perspective from like the preeminent booking agent of like, I guess, quote unquote, like indie bands, although that's like the most antiquated, ridiculous term at this point in time, but really like forged like a great alternative to the larger corporate booking infrastructure, and I think influenced a lot of people along the way as far as her level of taste, the bands that she worked with, the style of show curation, because Michelle and Panache had a big impact at South by Southwest and CMJ, and they did a boat cruise and just a gang of stuff. So anyway, I will probably even talk a little bit more about that in the intro of the next episode. So with that being said, again, I appreciate you tuning in to my weekly podcast, The House List. This is the final episode of 2016. What a year it has been. I'm exhausted, frankly, and a bit browbeaten, a little concerned and depressed at the loss of so many great artists, but motivated and inspired to connect with more and more people now more than ever. So again, I appreciate you guys tuning in. If this is your first time, you can find us on iTunes. It's also available at SoundCloud and the Stitcher app, and hopefully in the new year it'll be a little broader, but for now, it's, if you can find it, then all I ask is that you send a link to a friend or tell a friend about it. It's not something where I'm part of any kind of big, podcast network or some broad marketing reach here. So really, it's a word of mouth thing, much like Panache Magazine was. So if you dig it, if you dig the conversations, I try to intentionally make them about different kinds of people in music, so different genres, different kinds of fields, from publicists to hip-hop artists, tour managers and show promoters, band managers, journalists, radio DJs and stuff. This is all like where we've kind of come from since the beginning of September. So it's really just been around for a hot minute, but we're going to keep it going. There's no doubt about it. You know what I'm saying? So I appreciate you. I want to send a strong shout out and thanks to CJ Stewart, who's edited and engineered all these episodes with me, and to Dame Funk and the crew for allowing me to use this track as our opening joint this year. So yes, thank you again. If you're a subscriber to this, I genuinely appreciate it. And without further ado, here is the first part of my conversation with Michelle Cable of Panache Booking. Check it out. So you were born in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes, I was born in Washington,
So
D.C.
you grew up in D.C.?
Till I was 8 years old.
What do you remember? What are your memories of living in D.C. like?
Well, I remember snow and seasons, but I was pretty young when we moved across the country because I'm from a family of 6 people, and
Oh, really?
yeah, and me and my 3 siblings and my parents moved across the country when I was 8 years old in a station wagon. And
Do you remember that?
I do remember that. Made the great migration west. I remember that car trip in very specific detail.
What time of year was that?
Summer. It was right before my birthday because I think I turned 8 in that year that we moved. So it was in July.
So but you didn't end up in Eureka though, did you? Or
So we drove across the country in a station wagon from DC to Humboldt County, but we didn't move to Eureka. I kind of spent a lot of time in Eureka as I got older, but we moved to a town called Fortuna in California.
Wow. Okay, well that's amazing because that's how we know each other really. So is in like, you know, people associate Humboldt County without really knowing like any of the towns per se, you know, like, and obviously there's, you know, there's
it's a dream. It's an emerald dream.
Yeah.
For many people.
And I don't think I really realized, although now it's kind of coming back to me because it has been a while too, but that you at first lived in Fortuna, right? And
I lived in Fortuna, which is a very small, more country town, smaller than Eureka. Or the two big things that happen in Fortuna are pretty much like the rodeo and the daffodil show.
What is that? I don't remember the daffodil show. That's like
you
the flower
show.
I
remember what a daffodil show is unless you ended up going specifically to Fortuna for it. But yeah, there'd be a big flower show where they'd have like 300 different species of daffodils. And that was a big deal. And then there'd also be the rodeo, which would come to town. Or like, you know, I grew up in a town where there'd be parades, and the big thing that weekend at the parade would be like a cow patty toss, which is, I don't know if you know what that is.
Is that just like a big pile of cow shit, or is that?
It's pretty much like a cow patty. When a cow shits, it, you know, kind of becomes like a pancake, and they collect these for this big event over the weekend in Fortuna, and then locals see how far they can throw these patties, like disc throwing in, like, you know, the Olympics.
Right.
And but they do it on the main street of town, and I just remember being like 9 years old and watching pretty much like cow shit hit buildings, like the local banks and like shops. That was a big thing. A bunch of other stuff like penny scrambles and.
What's that?
Penny scrambles was something I actually looked forward to as a kid, but that pretty much is as it sounds.
That's just people throwing pennies on the ground.
There would be a roped off area, and they would collect pennies all year round. You'd go into like a local supermarket or like liquor store, grocery store, and there'd be a big jar collecting pennies for the penny scramble. And then they pretty much throw thousands and thousands of pennies out. But if there's a penny painted red or blue, it signifies a certain amount of money that you can get. So then they throw pennies out, and kids are supposed to, you know, very greedy thing actually to think about now, that they're encouraging kids to like push other kids down and grab pennies. And then if you get a colored penny, you actually win $5 or $10. And that was another big thing for kids locally in my town. And
dang.
$5 meant a lot when you're 9 years old or 10 years old.
Yeah. And
buy a lot of candy for that $5 bill.
Yeah. So how would you spend that in Fortuna? What do you do in Fortuna? Now I've been to Fortuna. I know, I mean, but it's been a while, and I know some people that still live there. In fact, I really like Fortuna. It's a beautiful little town, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think its town slogan is the friendly city. With $5 at 10 years old, I probably bought candy and like Pogs or something.
Yeah.
Like along those lines.
So, but now I met you in
I was a little older.
Yeah, but not really that much. Maybe 10 years later, or no, I met you. You were 16 when I met you.
Yeah, I think I was 16 or 17.
So it was like 8 years later.
Yeah.
So 8 years after you were flipping Pogs in Fortuna after the penny scramble, you were booking shows all of 10 miles north in Eureka, right?
Yeah, I was booking shows in Eureka, and then a little north of that in Arcata.
But that was already high school for you?
Yeah, pretty much when I was 15, I started a zine called Panache. And
in Eureka, California.
In Eureka. Yeah, in Eureka, California.
You were going to Eureka High School.
So pretty much when I was living in Fortuna, going to school in Fortuna, but then we kind of decided that going to Eureka was probably better suited because things at the schools we were in Fortuna. Like I went to a school in Fortuna, a Christian school in Fortuna for a couple of years where it was literally in a trailer, and there were 2 girls in my class and like 18 boys or like 15 boys. So it was a very small school, and like, but I could get a better education in Eureka. So I ended up going to Eureka High, which was about a 15-minute, 20-minute drive from Fortuna. So my dad drove me every day back and forth when I started doing that in like, I think when I was like in 5th grade. But anyway, so I kind of started to get roots in Eureka, even though I lived in Fortuna.
Right. And what people, just for some context as far as geographically and in California rather, is that all, like, the whole county of Humboldt and the towns that are sort of, along the highway, it's all along the 101, so, if you're living in LA, which you live in LA now, but like, anyone that's traveled in California knows that the highway 101 goes the whole length of the state, and it's funny because you'll be driving around in LA, but all the way up in Fortuna and Eureka and Arcata, that it's still the 101. So, I mean, sure. But anyway, I wanted to say that for some context.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think Northern California is San Francisco, but San Francisco is actually kind of a little more central California.
Right.
Yeah, Eureka, Fortuna, Arcata, Humboldt County is the true Northern California, but that's like 5-hour drive north of San Francisco. I mean, where I grew up is an hour, or where we lived is like an hour south of the Oregon border, hour and a half south.
Right.
And but yeah, it's on the coastline in the Highway 101 goes along the coastline, but it's a beautiful drive. It's just really out of the way if you decided to take the 101. Like, people that go through Eureka, there's a specific reason they're probably traveling through. They're going out of their way.
They're going to buy, heroin, basically. Just kidding. I'm kidding. Right. No, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it's one of the most beautiful places. The sequoias are so like majestic. There's an amazing, amazing beaches and rivers, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And there's this kind of whole like mystique to it. There's like a Twin Peaks vibe to the whole area. There's a lot of interesting music and art and culture coming out of there. I mean, or there was still, I think, but definitely when we both were living there.
Right. And now let's go back just a little bit to high school and stuff, because that's basically when you started getting into. That's when Panache started as a zine, and basically shortly after that, when you started doing shows, which is what many people obviously know you for, is your shows. How did, not to be as elementary as how did like the Panache zine start, but you had obviously gone to a couple of shows before you started that, right? Like, because how were you absorbing, pop culture and music and formulating your like tastes like in a place that's kind of out of the way, like Eureka and Fortuna?
I would go to shows. I think I started going to shows when I was 14, and I would go to various shows at places like this seafood restaurant called The Vista, or there was a bar called Hefe's that Hefe from NoFX owned. Saw a band called Turbo Negro there, and I went to a bunch of shows when I was 14, 15. I was lucky because my mom kind of didn't ask a lot of questions and seemed to be okay with. She trusted me to go to all these venues and stuff, because a lot of these places, we're all ages, but definitely kind of wilder places to hang out. But I've always loved music and found different ways of discovering new stuff. But this is predating like people being really online, and so you find out about stuff through like MTV, or a lot of stuff I discovered was through, I don't know how many people remember this, but you used to be able to buy like one record on Columbia Records and then get like 12 other records for free. Yeah,
it was like the CD club or something like that.
So I would just find out about a lot of new stuff through that. But a lot of those bands obviously weren't going through Eureka. But so a lot of the things that I was listening to was more like punk or noisy, were just bands that were traveling through town at these venues. But there was only a few different venues to go to, and so you kind of just ended up going there and then watching whatever random show was there. But I saw like At the Drive-In when I was like 15 there, and a lot of shows
at the Vista.
At the Vista when I was like 15, before I started a zine. And a lot of amazing bands went through there, but it was kind of like whatever came through you wanted to check out, and you were always pretty pleasantly surprised. And when you're 15 and you're living in a town like Eureka, an isolated area, it doesn't take a lot to kind of, inspire you or influence you in some other way, because you're not exposed to that many different things there.
Right. Yeah. It's not sheltered per se because everyone had the TV, but like it's way out of the way, and it is kind of an insular community with a lot of sort of weird anarchist type subculture, like the transient subculture definitely permeates there. That's what I noticed when I moved there. So what was the first show so from there, what was the first show that you put on? Because that must have been right around the time that I first met you, was shortly thereafter, I think.
Yeah, I think the first show I put on, I mean, the first issue of the magazine came out January 15th.
All right, so I'm sorry. So the magazine really predates any kind of shows. Yeah, I want to talk about that.
So I started to do a zine pretty much out of boredom. You know, I always loved writing and got really into creative writing, and that was something in school I always enjoyed. And so while I was in high school still, I kind of decided to start a zine and kind of combine two things that I love, writing and absorbing music, and decided to start a zine that was, you know, the first issue was like photocopied, 400 hand like collated copies, like, and you know, I'd go to the local copy place and do it myself and sit in a diner.
You did 400 copies of the first issue of Panache?
400 copies. It was free. A lot of errors in that first issue, but I put a local band on the cover called the Sin Men from Eureka,
yes,
who were amazing. But because I was doing this, the first issue of the zine, I decided to have a magazine zine release party.
Right.
And that was, I believe, the first show I booked. So the first show I booked was like January 15th, 1998.
Oh, you remember the date? Okay.
I don't remember who played, but I remember the date. But I mean, it probably was a Sin Man, because I mean, the idea with the magazine release parties was that bands that I'd interviewed would either be from Eureka, Arcata, or Humboldt and play, or a band from the Bay Area or somewhere would come down and play the release party.
That's almost 18 years ago. Can you believe that?
I know, it's crazy.
That's amazing. So 1998. So I moved to Humboldt, to Arcata, to go to Humboldt State University from Portland, Oregon, in 2000 or 2001, somewhere, I forgot when, because I lived in Portland for about 2.5 years. I moved there from New York. So not to get too off the top, but it's context. It's all about, I'm trying to have context for my listenership. So anyway, it had only been like a couple of years that you were doing shows, but I do remember when I first met you that the shows sort of facilitated the magazine. So there were release parties both to get the magazine, but then there was these benefit shows too to help publish the magazine, and would, you know, later distribute it as it kind of got, you know, you would slowly start distributing it outside of Humboldt. But it was, for the first couple of years, it was really just like in Humboldt County, right?
Yeah, the first few issues were definitely only Humboldt County based, and I think as I got into doing shows and realized that, you know, I could actually reach out to a band and bring them to the city that I lived in and have them play and then interview them, you know, I had created my own valuable resource to create, you know, information to cover. And so I started putting on a lot of shows after that first year of doing the magazine. And I think I started doing 2 shows a week, or sometimes 3 shows a week. And, you know, and through doing that, and it was all like, you know, very like experimental. You know, I learned as I went. Learned as I went along. It didn't, you know, I started doing shows at a lot of the places that I went to shows in the beginning, but then found new venues to book shows.
I remember too that a lot of the shows, the venues that you were booking, you weren't not 21 yet, so you couldn't even go. You had to stay at the door and like work the door, right?
Well, most of the places like the Vista, they would let me hang out there and stuff. So I kind of chose places that would let me hang out. And I kind of tried to do as many all ages shows and 18 up shows as possible. But there definitely were like some bars that started to see that I was putting on all these shows that people were going to, and they would invite me to do shows there. But then because I was under 21, they would tell me that I couldn't actually go in. I'd have to sit outside, which, you know, it defeats the whole purpose of why I'm putting on shows. Right. Even though I have had several shows where I was working the door and I didn't even get to watch the performance because I was in the other room, you know, working the door. But that the whole experience was fun, and I like being busy, and, you know, and it's still true to this day where I like being active. So having a role in running an event was interesting and kept me like, you know, like there was some sort of like adrenaline from that. So even though I sometimes wouldn't get to watch the whole show because I was working the door, it was still fun. And I was like, a teenager. So everything's like new. And then you kind of realize it's exciting when you realize you kind of have this power to create your own entertainment. And
yeah, because you hadn't even you hadn't seen a show out of town really, right? Like
I would go to San Francisco and watch and go to shows. I mean, going to the city, the city in quotes being San Francisco,
right.
and watch shows at like the Fillmore and Warfield, which is really interesting now because I book a lot of shows there.
Yeah.
But going to places, I mean, I remember this funny memory for me of going to see some band. I don't remember who it was. It might have been like Weezer or Radiohead or someone, and like Cool as Shaker. I don't know. One of these bands I saw at the Fillmore when I was like 16, and meeting some girl in the pit who had told me she'd been to 400 shows in her life. And I remember thinking that was so cool and aspiring to be just like her. And now I've been to, who knows how many
4
shows.
million?
Definitely, definitely not a million, but way over 400 shows, thousands of shows, put on thousands of shows.
I mean, you probably book over 400 shows a year, I would assume.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and our agency books well over that. But personally, yeah, I mean, I think at certain South by Southwest, I put on over 110 shows.
Right.
And so, but at that instance, when I was 16 or so, that seemed so cool to me that someone had, in their lifetime, been to that many musical performances. And I mean, it was just what I was all about. I mean, and I still am so, like inspired by music. But back then especially, I just, loved going to shows. And so putting on a show and being at a show for 7 hours a night or 8 hours a night was like the only thing I wanted to be doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it became such a part of that community in Humboldt too, where it was the magazine and the shows that sort of existed around it created a community of bands because you were so generous with your coverage of those bands, especially the Eureka bands too, which was, now we're talking about like late 90s, early 2000s and stuff. So just for some context, because unless you like really like live in Humboldt or grew up there or something, then a lot of this would be pretty unfamiliar. Even the venues, the Vista was like 100 capacity room in the back of a seafood restaurant right on the Humboldt Bay or something, right? Yeah,
the Vista was a seafood restaurant that, at night when the lights were on, you could tell that, I mean, it was like, pretty. There was like pink leather booths. But at night, it kind of became this debaucherous, crazy like punk venue where I saw some insane stuff, like, I mean, and being like 16 or 17 and going to shows and not, I didn't drink at these shows and then seeing everyone else get really wasted. And I think when you live in a small town and you don't really have to, or like, like certain towns, there's not that high of a bar of like things you have to do the next day. It's not as like, it's not as like crazy, bustling, active, like there's definitely a level of people party hard. And so,
yeah, there's a great deal of pressure to do much of anything else,
Yeah. So I mean,
especially when you're like 19, 20, 21.
Yeah. And I was 16 hanging out with people who were like in their mid 20s and people that would definitely rage. It didn't matter if it was Monday or Tuesday night, which is really good when you're putting on shows. A Monday night didn't matter if it was Friday night or Monday night, people would still come out.
Right.
And, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of venues where, you were definitely exposed to some crazy behavior, which kind of, I think, made it memorable for bands that would come through as well. Like I was just recounting a story recently to someone about watching this band. I can't remember the name of the band, but there was a woman in the band who was 80 or 90 years old who played bass, who was like the oldest bassist. Like she was like, like a guitarist or bassist that was like a grandmother. And the band had been on like Jerry Springer. And they came through Eureka. There weren't that many people there, but the whole thing that people loved seeing this band for was that the singer would vomit while he sang.
What was the band?
I don't remember. I'll have to look this up. But
that was his thing.
But he would drink orange soda and then vomit orange soda. And I remember being like 17 because I would film every show I went to. So I'd be in the corner of the venue filming and watching all these like metal Hesher dudes watching the singer and then trying to like swallow the vomit as the owner of the club is like trying to catch the vomit in garbage bags where they didn't have a crazier job, but that was like something kind of normal. I mean, it's so insane to think about now, but singer vomits, people are actually swallowing his vomit because it's some sort of like, like experience, like
Oh my God.
special, like, like communion they're receiving or something. I don't know. I was sitting in the very far corner. But then also there's like a 80 or 90-year-old, grandmother playing in the band, like so bizarre. But I saw so many bands, like, and that was like a big deal, like in Eureka. And I think one of the things too to talk about before, we go into like shows, is just that like most of the if anyone wants to find a back issue of Panache, it's very hard. They're not really online, and none of them are online except for one issue. But while we were in Eureka, and you know this because you used to write for Panache
Yeah,
too,
I contributed
which
a lot to Panache.
we might get to later. But a lot of the stuff we covered in the zine wasn't all music based.
No, not at all. No.
I mean, we interviewed Jared Fogle from Subway.
Right.
Because he did a Subway tour and came through Eureka. That was big news.
You interviewed him, didn't you?
Chris Collin, a good friend of mine who lives in Eureka, did. We covered a music festival that was a Christian music festival called Jesus in the Park, JIP Festival. That's, music related. But then, we did stories where we interviewed the founder of the creator of the Garbage Pail Kids.
Right.
I believe Jim Pound, who lived in Humboldt. I could be wrong, but I think it's Jim Pound. And, we interviewed Corey Feldman.
That was he was on the cover.
Yeah, Corey Feldman was on the cover. But
this is like, what year was that? Because this wasn't even...
That was in early 2000s.
Right.
we interviewed, there was a lot of like not music related stuff, but things that were still significant cultural things that happened in Eureka.
I interviewed like the local weatherman or something. Do you remember? It wasn't Joel Agnew. It was the other guy he was like a real buttoned up conservative sort of nerd with glasses.
I remember that you did something like that. The thing I remember when I think about you writing, because you wrote for Panache.
Yeah.
The one story I remember that you did is you did a local review, or you wrote a little piece on the zoo about a chimpanzee that was at the zoo, and I think you wrote sort of almost like a love story about this
Right.
animal at the zoo that a lot of people got upset about for some reason.
Well, yeah, because it was like a semi-fictional story about this caged animal, And I'd have to go back and read it, but I do remember because letters were sent to Panache magazine about it, and people were upset. I think they were confused about what I was doing with the piece, because it was I think both pseudo semi-autobiographical, as well as like, it was like kind of experimental art piece too, because it was somewhat from either the perspective of a lover of the primate in the zoo, but also there was something a caged thing. It was the shit was like so ahead of its time that of course it was going to upset people. They didn't know how to deal with that, So anyway, but yeah, that was a great one.
Yeah, people in Eureka didn't know how to handle that at that time. But yeah, we would do bathroom reviews, restaurant reviews.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of it got pretty weird. Panache personals.
Yes.
People finding love.
How many issues in total did you publish?
Now I don't even remember exactly how many, but I think we did about 28. But
okay.
When I moved, so Panache continued as a zine when I moved to San Francisco, and then when I moved to New York, we did one last issue, and then since then I haven't done an issue in like almost 10 years.
Right. So so the bulk of it really is a Humboldt kind of local scene magazine. It's a classic zine in the sense of many beautiful American classic punk zines. Although it was very specific to the kind of flavor of Humboldt, the humor, this sort of dark, sarcastic, downtrodden, yet like super supportive too, because it was like, you were writing. Everyone. There was a lot of contributors too, but they were writing a lot about locals, but lots of like small indie bands, because you would get like records 7 inches and stuff mailed to you. And
yeah, we do album reviews, but yeah, we did have a lot of local contributors, and also if people wrote in and wrote a letter, I would publish it, and
right.
that got pretty weird and interesting, because in Eureka, for those who have been there, you probably, if you have happened to have the luxury of driving through Eureka, which you have to, if you're on the 101, you have to drive through Eureka because there's no other way. It's not an exit you get off at. You actually physically have to pass through Eureka.
And
so
Arcata.
And well, Arcata you kind of drive over.
Oh, right.
But,
yeah, I guess you drive through the town of Eureka.
Yeah, but with Eureka, you go through the local mall that I had the luxury of working at. But
Where did you work at in the mall?
My first real job was at Orange Julius, slinging smoothies.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, I'm proud about it. It was kind of a punk rock Orange Julius. Lots of punk girls, all women, work there. But, like if you go through Eureka, I mean, I have many people that didn't realize I grew up there and then they went through there accidentally and then have some very interesting stories. But, it's a very vibrant place. And so growing up there and then being exposed to so many different things and then working with a lot of musicians and artists from there definitely gave a lot of flair to the zine, which, I'm still really proud of all those issues.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a shame that currently you can't really find them online too much, but there is like an archaic website that still exists, right? Not that you have to expose that, but at some point in time, would you ever like try to re-release everything or do like some kind of, I don't know what the right word is for that, but
I definitely, I have probably one copy each of previous issues, and I have thought about having them scanned and put online just, for my own personal sake of just having an archive of that in case, the ones I have get water damage or go up in flames or something, and like,
they're all newsprint zines, right?
They're all newsprint. And then I definitely have, one thing I want to find, this is just something I've thought about, because when you move around to so many different cities, as I've done, you kind of like leave stuff behind. But I definitely have like, boxes of tapes of like videos and audio tapes that actually might just be destroyed from wherever they were stored. And those things are of interest to me because like so many of those things were just these moments and times that I captured, or like photos from all these things.
You still have them?
Well, they're all like stored at my mom's house, but
wow.
I think a lot of them were damaged by like a storm or something. I'm not sure. I have to find them. But the zines. I think I actually might be missing one copy of one of the issues of the zines. But
I got them all too.
Okay, we can, between our two collections, we can put them up.
I don't get rid of anything.
If anyone happens to actually want to read about a lot of those early things. But we did interview bands that were more well known that came through Eureka. We interviewed the White Stripes and put them on the cover. They played at the Vista for $5, and we interviewed the Flaming Lips. Not when they didn't come through Eureka, but we went down to San Francisco to interview them. But 90% of the bands we interviewed came through Eureka. Neil Hamburger was on the cover.
Lou Barlow.
Billy
Nair Show.
Billy Nair Show of Montreal was in an issue. A ton of bands. A lot of people that I actually still am friends with or work with in some capacity today. And there was a lot of, some bigger indie bands, but then a lot of also just weird, really weird stuff. I believe you were on the cover of one of them as an image of you as a child.
Yeah, an image of me as a child. It was an honor. It still is. I still have it. Although somehow it's the inkiest copy of any issue that's like, you can't touch it without. But I really left my mark that way.
Yeah, I think when you're publishing something, because we would go first they were photocopied, but then eventually I started using a printing press.
Where was that based?
The printing press we used was in Willits, which is 2 hours south of Eureka. But the printing press we used, it was always hit or miss how it came out. And
right, I remember that.
And the issue with a young Peter Agoston on it actually it came out damaged, and there was a very inky cover.
It's fine. It's a story of my life. It's all good.
I think I remember writing an apology. I think I wrote an apology insert that went in all the issues of that zine because of that.
We're sorry we made your hands so dirty. For a moment, I would love to kind of just quickly talk about the bands in Humboldt too, because I do feel like that it plays a big part into how the magazine evolved into the booking agency, which is what people know and love so well now, currently. But I think it wouldn't have really turned into what it is today if it wasn't for this sort of bed of local groups that would both headline a bunch of shows, but also would open up, for the touring acts. And really, that's where I got my chops as a promoter too, because I would, while you were doing the more left field and rock stuff and experimental punk shows and stuff like that, I was doing hip hop shows too. So we were kind of working in tandem, but I was really learning from you the whole time because, I hadn't worked with a booking agent as a promoter until I got to Humboldt too. So really quickly, let's run down if you can remember some of those groups from Humboldt too, just because they were so instrumental to the early days of the magazine. Do you know what ones kind of come to mind, that you covered a bunch or that played a lot?
I mean, the first one we interviewed was the Sin Men, who I think were a very influential, legendary Eureka band that doesn't exist. You can still find their stuff on LPs in some places, but it's hard.
Great, not necessarily not like indie rock, but I guess there was the maybe be the the closest thing you would. What would you describe them as?
I mean, it's hard, but yeah, definitely
college rock.
Indie, no, not college rock, but kind of indie rock,
pop.
But indie pop, a lot of really pretty melodies and songs, but I mean they were great, really catchy pop songs, but I mean I feel I still honestly feel, after living in so many different cities and working with so many bands, that some of the best music I've been exposed to has come from Humboldt. But unfortunately a lot of that music hasn't ever really been exposed outside of Humboldt, but there are a lot of bands that came out of that scene that still exist, maybe in new incarnations or in the original form, that I love everything I hear from them. But other bands, the Sin Men were the band that I think it was the band that I was first exposed to locally when I did the zine. Another band that originally was called Audio Wreck, that my friend Chris was in, that became a band called Eureka Garbage Company, was super influential to me. And Chris also was somebody, Chris, who's the drummer and sings in the band, exposed me to ELO, who are one of my favorite bands now, and Flaming Lips, and a very Eureka Garbage Company, that's their name now, or a very weird pop band that I feel kind of tie a lot of things from ELO and Flaming Lips together. Right.
And Chris from Audio Wreck he was in that Couch?
He was in a band called Couch that became Couch of Eureka, and he was somebody who ended up doing a lot of articles for Panache and became a big supporter and an inspiration to me. And he exposed me to a lot of different things and bands. But, originally the magazine kind of was Eureka-centric, but then we kind of expanded out of that to Arcata, which is more of the college town. Right. And I think other bands kind of from Arcata and Eureka, the Hitch.
Hitch was a great kind of sludgy metal rock band.
Metal band, all bearded men, really heavy. Another band was Tiger Bomb. Right. Guided by Voices. So Guided by Voices cover band. And but there were a lot of different bands. A band called
Automatic Pink.
I was gonna say Automatic Pink.
Strawberry Black.
Strawberry Black. I don't really remember as much. Maybe that was a personal favorite of yours. But Automatic Pink were amazing, and they became a band later that was the Monster Women. Yeah. And but a lot of these people that became friends of mine through doing the zine and putting on shows still do shows or in bands or put on shows in Eureka or Arcata, but they're still in bands to this day in various incarnations. There was another band called the Cutters who were kind of from Eureka and Arcata.
Yeah, they were pretty huge for a while too as a local band. Yeah, which was interesting because that local scene had its own thing that didn't exist, outside of Humboldt, which has to be indicative of so many other, small towns and areas in America too. So.
Well, I think one thing that I have noticed, because now I book tours for bands across the country, but growing up in a town and putting on shows in a town like Eureka, it was really important to have a strong local band on the bill to get people out, because even if a band was sort of well known, people were more likely to go out if there was a local band on the bill. Right. And as a booking agent, sometimes now I do really think it's important when you're touring to have a local band on the bill. Sometimes, if it's a smaller band touring, to kind of get the word of mouth out through that local band's promotion. But then also I think if you're a bigger band, it's kind of cool to allow that local band to be exposed to a different audience through opening up for, your set. And so trying to support local bands and make sure they're treated fairly and help them kind of navigate their way through booking their own shows or putting them on the bill.
Right.
It's something that I think is really important that a lot of people don't realize but for me growing up in Eureka and booking shows there for 5 or 6 years, that was something that I noticed was really did really have an impact and an effect and on sometimes attendance of the shows depending on the band that was coming through, but then also, a band I work with might play a show because they knew, and they would offer to play last. Local band would play last because they could get people out and then keep people there. But then also, they could then get the opportunity through me if I put on a show with of Montreal or Lou Barlow or Bonnie Prince Billy or or someone. They would get to open up that show. And, and get to play a cool show with their idols, and stuff, or someone that they looked up to. And so it's kind of this cool balance. And I just think that's a really important integral part of any kind of musical community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I even met you through a local act personally because I think he somehow connected us. But there was a local rapper named Manifest, who I'm still friends with today. And
I thought you were going to say Big Moosey or...
But I remember he somehow I think that's how we got connected or I don't remember. And we don't have to go too deep on the local stuff because so many people know you for so much other stuff too. And I want to get to the meat of...
Can we talk about Bummerfest though?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Bummerfest was a festival that a local sort of music and alternative art punk festival in a Vets Hall that you booked. I'll let you describe it, but I want to preface this by saying that it was sort of like the antithesis of this more kind of metal fest called Summerfest that was in town, right?
Yeah, so me and a few friends from another event space and promoter company called Placebo decided to put on an event called Bummerfest. That was kind of a movement that was a reaction to an event called Summerfest that would happen in Eureka, and this Summerfest event, it was a weird event where they kind of alienated a lot of local bands and didn't really support them, and they would have a local female band play, but they would have the band play before the bikini contest, and stuff like that. So as a reaction to that, we decided on the same day as Summerfest to put on an event called Bummerfest, but it would be completely opposite. We wouldn't have it in an outdoor environment in the sun. We would do it in a basement, which happened to be a Vets Hall basement. We would make sure it was cold. We actually did turn up the AC and then turn on fog machines and covered the walls in tinfoil because it just looked cool. But we started booking a lot of local bands and then out-of-town bands at this event and having it kind of be a weird freak show carnival.
Right.
To create something for all the local bands that were getting dismissed by this festival that, had originally kind of started to maybe kind of embrace, what Humboldt was or whatever. And Humboldt and the scene there is so small that something like this did kind of make a difference and have an impact or was something that people noticed, but it was cool because through doing Bummerfest, I learned a lot as a promoter and, we got to bring other bigger bands to town and also get to really develop the weird festival environment or carnival setting. We had a Bummerfest clown, we had $5 haircuts, we had a raffle, and a lot of that stuff I feel like if I look at my life now and what I do has been I think a lot of the things I did back then I still directly implement now, which is interesting to think about. That
formula you've used in alternative places since then in South by Southwest, the Brews Cruise, the CMJ. But Bummerfest really was kind of laid the groundwork for that. But I will make one quick point is that there was one and only artist that played both Summerfest and Bummerfest, and that's me. So I just want to let that be known.
Thanksgiving Brown?
As Thanksgiving Brown, I was able to play both because I made sure that those are both sides of that community were friends of mine. So.
Did you get any hate mail because you did that? Because I got a lot of hate mail because we started Bummerfest.
I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I don't think I got any hate mail, but I did play pretty early in the day. So
I think there was a rapper named Garth Vader that was from Humboldt that played Summerfest who got very upset with me doing Bummerfest, and he wrote a whole rap about Panache, but I think he called it Poo Nasty.
Well, I think at that time everyone was young. He's still an active, a performer in Humboldt. I think at that time too, like, everyone was kind of young, and maybe, everyone started had their own, when you're 20 years old.
But these sort of things were things that kind of made it fun and exciting.
Absolutely.
Like in that town, because it was like small town dramas, and a lot of that stuff was captured in Panache in a very like entertaining, charming way.
Yeah, very innocent, and it's like two different worlds. I mean, you take the kind of weed culture and the metal bands and the hip hop stuff locally, and then of course like the freaks and the weirdos that play like that go to Captured by Robots shows and stuff. They're just completely different. It's like high school.
Yeah, I remember we interviewed I think a metal band called Defecreation, and we interviewed them at the local mall, and then
Nice.
and then took them behind the mall to some railroad tracks where there was actually some like weird sacrificial ground that people would go to, and like graffiti walls and do rituals. But yeah, it was definitely like some weird stuff in those days.
So you eventually, though, when you moved to San Francisco, I'm trying to figure out a good way to transition it, because you were only in San Francisco. Like, there was definitely a period of time, because we sort of both moved away from Humboldt around the same time. Eventually, I would graduate from, I was there for college at Humboldt State. I know I said that earlier, which I loved, and I love that school. And I lived in Humboldt for 5 years. So, but I moved to New York, and then you had moved to San Francisco, and eventually sort of would make your way to New York. I'm trying to figure out a good segue into how by that time you had booked so many shows locally. You were literally the Bill Graham of Humboldt. That it was, obviously a move to San Francisco made a lot of sense in one regard. But you started booking shows for people outside of Humboldt too, like taking bands that you had developed a history with and started doing shows out at booking them, in other towns and cities. So what was the very first, what were some of those first experiences of booking, and what were those bands of you actually literally booking shows outside of Humboldt for the first time? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think I moved to San Francisco and kind of didn't expect anyone to really need somebody from like a small town girl from Eureka to book them shows in San Francisco. But then I realized a few months in that a lot of people that I had met in Eureka and put on shows for actually had developed like trust and, relationship with me. So they
Sure.
hit me up about booking shows with them. And that, was cool, but like surprising to me for whatever reason. I had low expectations of what was going to happen when I moved to San Francisco. But so a couple different bands that I had met when I lived in Eureka asked me to book tours for them. The initial bands were a band from San Francisco called the Shantigs, who I booked at the Vista, and they were in a bunch of issues, and I'd gotten to know them really well. And then another band named Shellshag, but I'd originally met them as Kung Fu USA, and they had come through Eureka a bunch. And some of these bands, decided, I want to go on tour, and they knew that through kind of doing the zine and booking shows, I kind of had all these contacts in all these cities, and they were like, well, you can connect all these dots from like if we want to go from Seattle to Portland to San Francisco to LA. And so I kind of got into the booking game through these bands from the Bay Area kind of having faith in me.
Did you already have the contacts, the promoter contacts?
No, but the amazing thing about if, like you want to know something, you just put that question out there in
Right.
the world. This is predating like Facebook or Twitter, but this is.
It didn't predate Friendster though. That Friendster.
No, I feel like Friendster was definitely happening, but you wouldn't. I don't think I ever used Friendster to help me book a show.
But you obviously had a network with the magazines.
Yeah, I literally had a Rolodex. I think I had index cards with contacts on it, and like back then when you're
Right.
booking shows, you're writing things in a notebook, and
Right.
And it was still in the days where you book a tour for somebody and people wouldn't know that a show was canceled until they physically got to the venue, because people wouldn't update their website and they wouldn't answer the phone.
Right.
I booked some crazy tours back then. But these bands like, the Shantigs and Shellshag had, faith in me to do these things. And and Shellshag definitely were the band that kind of helped me develop my wings or whatever so I could do other stuff. But because when I moved to San Francisco, I was working a job.
I remember I went.
Yeah, I was working in a shoe store, slinging instead of smoothies or, or whatever I did in Eureka, I was selling
Nikes.
retro sneakers.
I think I bought a pair
at this shoe store called Subterranean. But that shoe store definitely influenced a lot of my life because there was this whole like underground artist culture that, was there. It was a place where like skaters and like a lot of different artists would go and musicians would go and hang out. And I worked there for a year when I first moved to San Francisco when I was 21. And in that year, I met so many people that are still like friends in my life to this day. I'm godmother to one of the guys that I worked with there and then lived with.
John,
my friend John.
Shout out to John Constantino.
John Constantino, great band Telecommunications. Shout out to my godson Jude. And Benji.
And who was the John's partner in telecommunications?
My friend Newman. His real name's Jeremiah, who actually lives in LA now.
And he has what's his band now? He's got some music stuff going on right now.
Actually, don't know what his. Do you know what his band name is now?
I don't, but now I feel embarrassed because we're both recorded saying that. So, but shouts to him because he's cool. He's cool, mad cool, both of them.
Yeah, they're. I mean, but I met all these people in this. They're all great. Like, and especially those two, John and Newman. But I met all these people when I worked at the shoe store, and they kind of helped develop a community of people that we'll probably get into later that helped to, influence where I went next. But when I was working at that job, as some things do happen in life, like that job ended because the shoe store shut down.
Right.
And I ended up not really knowing what I was going to do, but then kind of decided to try to go into booking because I was booking tours while I was working there. And I mean, I've always been booking tours or doing a zine while I was working another job to,
sure,
pay the bills, sustain myself. But so in that moment in time, I ended up getting an opportunity from my friends in that band Shellshag, where they hired me to book them for an entire year of touring. And
how did that come about exactly?
Well,
what do you mean, like they hired you for a year? They're like, hey, we want to tour all year round. Like, can you do this, or how did it work?
Exactly that. I mean, they knew me from Eureka. I'd become friends with them in San Francisco. They tried to help me find a place to live when I moved to San Francisco. They were just, they became like kind of like my rock and roll parents when I moved to the Bay Area. And when I was losing this job, they were like, well, we kind of want to tour and we want you to book the tour. And I'd already been booking a couple tours, but they kind of gave me this job of booking them literally for an entire year. They wanted to tour the entire year.
That's a long tour.
Yeah, and I'd never really done any extensive booking. And I had friends, when I was booking shows in Eureka, I worked with booking agents and booking agencies. And so some of these people would help young me with contacts.
Right. Really quickly, what were the booking agencies that you remember working with at that time?
The main one was this agency called Cork that no longer exists, the Cork agency. But one of the guys from the agency, this guy named Eric,
right,
who lives in Houston now, who still books a band called Of Montreal.
He has an agency called Uncle Booking currently, right?
Yeah, Uncle Booking in Houston, and they work with Of Montreal and a lot of other great bands. But Eric, I'd been booking shows with since I was 18, and when I moved to San Francisco and started doing my own thing, he kind of gave me a lot of good advice and helped me with contacts, and so I kind of like connected the dots of a year-long tour for Shellshag.
Right.
And it ended up being more like a 9-month tour, but they played in New York. I remember this. They wanted to be in New York for a month. I booked them 17 shows in 21 days.
Whoa.
Which is insane to think about. And I flew to New York. I'd never been to New York before. I flew to New York for my first time and went to probably all 17 of those shows. I wouldn't recommend anyone playing 17 times in New York in 21 days now. But when we did it then, it was amazing. I mean, a lot of places that no longer exist, but they
played. Was this 2003, 4 or something, or 5?
This is like 2005,
right.
And they 2004, 2000, maybe more like 2003, 2004,
right?
But around that time, But we worked with a lot of different people, including like Todd P, who I worked with for many years after that. But they played underground bars, like weird, like restaurants, and they played a bar called Siberia, and that's where I met like a Conan and O'Brien impersonator named Clonan, and which she was later interviewed in Panache, in the zine. But I definitely kind of had my booking boot camp through working with them. And when I started working with them, I also started working with a Japanese band named DMBQ, who booked a Japanese tour for Shellshag all over Japan, and then the band invited me to go with them to Japan. So at the end of the year, it all kind of culminated in Japan. It was the first time I'd ever been out of the country at like 22 or 21, and it was just an amazing experience all around. But I mean, it was definitely like insane to book 9 months of shows in a year for somebody when you don't really know what you're doing and you're figuring it out.
No, and you would later end up, I mean, you've done that later for other groups that were, because you definitely handled some super heavy touring acts that were like, okay, we want to play like, and that's sort of like that Black Flag kind of paved the way for that, where it's just like you just fucking play like every day, or you just drive 10 hours like to the next show. Not that that's recommended as far as a booking agent goes for routing wise, but you just play wherever you can play,
Yeah, and back then it was a different thing where
Right.
it was predating like people being exposed to things online, and so if you really wanted to have like nowadays, it's like if you can develop a fan base without even leaving your kitchen or bedroom.
Right.
But back then, if you wanted to develop a fan base, you had to physically go to them and play in front of them, and then you'd want to go back and play in front of them again 2 months later, and then 4 months later, and that's kind of how you developed like a community of people that cared about your band. And so that kind of grassroots approach of booking people that actively really did work, and it was the best way to expose yourself to people back then. I mean, it's different now. I mean, touring is such a huge integral element of how bands reach audiences now, but it's a different level of exposure.
Yeah, it doesn't really work the way it did 10 years ago, or 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah, that sort of like crazy, grueling touring road schedule isn't as necessary now, which is is great. It makes it a little easier and stuff. But because of that, what makes it harder is that you're overly exposed to way too much stuff.
Right. So a group can't really establish themselves unless they follow a certain model. It's a little more commodified, where a Shell Shag style group, or like Plesiosaur, or some of the groups of that era too, or Big A, Little A, the Apes, like some of the early Panache stuff. You can't look at my notes. That would develop history by playing every 3, 4, 6 months over and over and over.
Well, I mean, a perfect example is I grew up in Eureka, put on shows in Eureka. There were certain bands from San Francisco that would go up to Eureka and play 6 times out of a year, and they would draw 200 or 300 people in Eureka because they built that fan base.
Like the Coach Whips would probably be a good example of that. Right?
Yeah, like the Coach Whips, which is the band that John Dwyer of the OCs now was in before he was in the OCs, or before he was in OCS or the OCs. Coach Whips came after his other band, Pink and Brown. But yeah, I met John in Pink and Brown, but then kind of really got to know him when he was in the Coach Whips. But yeah, they would come up to Eureka a lot, and as a local promoter and like kid that had space, I would put these bands up in my house too. So
right, that's true.
So many bands, like hundreds of bands, have stayed with me over the years. And
that was another thing I remember from Humboldt too, is bands. That was sleeping at people's houses and stuff. It doesn't happen as much, but bands still sleep at your house though, right? Like now.
Very few bands sleep in my house nowadays. But up until recently, yes, a lot of bands still stay at my house. But I still extend that hospitality to bands. But back then, and also when you're like, I remember being 16 and a band called The Criminals were staying at my house, a band from Berkeley, San Francisco. And this is in Eureka. But, I lived with my mom, but I kind of lived in an empty house because my mom worked a lot. She worked the night shift as a nurse and was always at her, boyfriend's house. So I kind of lived for the last 3 years of my time in Humboldt from my time as a teenager, from 15 to 17, I lived in a pretty much empty house, and bands would stay at the house, and she was okay with that. But it was funny because a lot of bands would stay there and actually think that it was my apartment and that I lived alone. And then the cat was out of the bag when they would look at my so-called life videotapes on the wall, or and stuff.
Right.
But I never was really hiding that fact, but it was just funny because, my mom, without really realizing it, also housed a lot of bands.
Right. So at what point did you come, I kind of know the answer to this question, because when you moved to New York, obviously, or when did you get to the point where you knew that, it was time to leave San Francisco and come to New York? Because that was obviously a big turning point for you just in your life, but obviously for Panache, it sort of solidified it a little bit more as an agency, right?
Yeah, when I was living in San Francisco, I was working out of my house by myself and booking tours incessantly. And I after I lost the job at the shoe store, that was my last real job, for somebody else, was when I was 21. But then when I started booking tours and did that full time and was working all the time. But 4 years into living in San Francisco, I decided I wanted to move to New York. But it was kind of just a thing where I wanted a change of pace, a different environment. San Francisco was an amazing city to live in, but kind of in some weird ways felt similar to Eureka, like, with this, it's like a smaller infrastructure of a community. And I kind of wanted to be challenged a little more. And one of the group of friends that I met through working at that shoe store were also in this band called The Mall.
Right.
And
early Panache band,
this band called The Mall from the Bay Area. And they were all deciding they wanted to move to New York. And I was, things in my life were changing, and I was getting out of like a serious relationship, and I kind of had the opportunity to move, and I decided to make that plunge and move to New York, with these guys. And one of the guys didn't have someone to live with, and so we became roommates, and that made it a lot easier to make that migration 3,000 miles across the country. And this was 10 years ago. I was 24. And so I made that big leap. And it was exciting, but I don't know if I would have done that if I hadn't met those guys and they kind of like encouraged me to do that.
Right. No, I remember that. I remember that time. It's kind of coming back to me. Yeah. I mean, I remember when you came to New York, because actually on a visit you stayed, you and the guys in The Mall stayed at my house. And at that time you like checked your email, and through that they were like, oh yeah, the Knitting Factory is looking for somebody. They're trying to hire somebody. And that random email, you forwarded it to me, and then I went in, I wrote them, I went in, I got a job interview, I got hired for it. And then, I was there at that club for, 2.5 years as a talent buyer there, which I now come to realize I talk about that in, I think, every single episode of this podcast, which is trying to phase out of that like a little, but nevertheless, it was a critical kind of change for me job-wise too, because I moved to New York to do my record label, and the distribution company went bankrupt, went belly up. I needed a job. I was working at Re-Up magazine. I don't know if you remember that, but I was hustling hard, working for a commission, selling ads and writing cover stories. So that job fell in my lap because you happened to be at the kitchen table checking your email. I went in there, got the job. And we had, sort of started working. I think you moved to New York shortly after that. But now, fast forward a little bit, the Knitting Factory closed at the end of, in December of 2008, essentially. And then I hit you up, and I'm like, listen, I think, I'd like to try working as a booking agent now. I've experienced a lot of dealings with booking agents on this level, as well as an independent promoter. So then you were gracious enough to, I think after some consideration, let me come aboard. After I tour managed a tour for a couple of months with themselves, good friends of mine, and that was a great experience in the spring of 2009. And then, because I was able to meet and see all these talent buyers and promoters face to face, like on a national tour. And then I started working as an agent out of that. And that's when I started coming here. Or, I say here because where we're doing the interview actually is not that far from where your old office used to be. So the point I'm trying to make, I don't know if I'm trying to make a point, but I want to, kind of talk about the early days of Panache in New York, because it's sort of almost the third wave. You've had I'd say maybe 5 waves of Panache as a entity, do you remember just in a nutshell what that was like, moving to New York, kind of starting? What was the roster at that time? Who were the artists and stuff like that?
Moving to New York definitely was one of the craziest things I did. I think I did it alone. I moved with a friend, but Panache as an agency was a company that I operated on my own. And, at the time, Shell Shag was still on the roster. I started working with a New York band called Big A Little A from Brooklyn, who were playing a lot and very, relevant at that time of what was going on in the scene in New York. They were playing a lot of Todd P shows with bands like These Are Powers and Matt and Kim and a lot of these different bands. And I remember when I moved to New York, I had met them at a CMJ festival, and I think we started talking, and I ended up working with them, and that definitely impacted a lot of what I ended up getting involved in New York. But then making that move to Brooklyn allowed me to really develop the agency, because I had already started putting on showcases at South by Southwest kind of as a one-person entity. But then when I was there, I met somebody who became a friend of mine and then became my first intern, this guy named Jesse Hodges,
Yes.
who worked at South by Southwest. And he, really loved all the bands I booked, and had really helped me get my foot in the door with South by Southwest. And so when I moved to New York, he was like, I really want to work with you, and I'll start as an intern, and I want to be an agent. And so he became my first intern.
Yes, I remember.
And then he became my first employee, my first agent. And when you have somebody else helping you, that like collaborative effort really does make a vast difference in what you can accomplish. And Jesse was kind of like my first venture into that door of being able to do more. And I feel like when I moved to New York, I was actually really surprised, because people had always told me, oh, like New York's cold, and people are like not very like receptive to like, being like helpful, and people are mean and angry. But when I moved here, I mean, I had friends here, and a lot of people were making that move from California to New York, but I felt like there was this very welcoming community of people that wanted to collaborate and do shows together.
Well, people love working with you. That's one thing, that's for sure. But
well, that's nice to hear. But I definitely had a very receptive audience of people that were stoked that I was here and wanted to collaborate on events. And so having an employee, that led to other employees.
Right.
And also like a bunch of people that had really really creative, innovative ideas, who, felt like they went through with those ideas. There was a follow through to it, which is something that I kind of, for whatever reason, found lacking in the Bay Area. But that helped me really grow Panache into, I think, what it's become, and really like help set the pace of me, being inspired and working harder, and developing, all the people that I work with today, and everything that we represent as a whole.
Right. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that we should do like a part 2 of this, just so, because I don't want to rush through all this stuff, because there's a lot of.
Can you do it in the next 2 days?
Yeah.
Okay,
I can do it in the next 2 days.
See? Yeah. We obviously have so much more to talk about. So we left it right there and picked it up the next day back in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, and talked a bunch more about the next sort of phase of Panache in New York and the move to LA. And we talked a lot about the different groups that Michelle's worked with, and the conversation got heavy. The conversation went as it does whenever you're talking to an old friend, a close friend. And that's what I really feel like this one was. And I definitely appreciated the time that Michelle was able to give me, so we could do such a long conversation. Funny enough, I just now I'm recording this outro on my phone, because I just ran out of space on my damn mic thing, and I'm not home. I'm in Virginia. I'm at my parents' house for the holidays, a couple days, and then I'll be back. So just classic house list shit, But hey, that's not going to stop us. It hasn't stopped us since up to this point, and we will continue on well into the coming year and beyond. So I wanted to say I appreciate you guys for sticking with me. This is our 14th episode. If it is your first time checking it out, especially if you're a friend or a fan of Michelle Cable's, then feel free to pass it along to someone else and let them be like, yo, you should check this out, man. That house list. You ever been on a house list? Well, you need to get up on this house list. Oh, they said their guest list is closed. Oh, we submitted our guest list a long time ago. You're not going to be able to get in. Then you just say, listen, check this out, man. I'm on Peter Agoston's house list. And then, oh, boom, bang, there you are, in there, on it, listening to any of the 14 episodes we've had up to this point. So listen, I hope that you guys had a good, great holiday season, a safe and happy, prosperous new year to come. I appreciate everything as far as you guys tuning in. I want to again send much thanks and gratitude to CJ Stewart for doing all the editing and engineering of these, and just being an great old friend who I've known since the days that I met Michelle Cable. I have a lot of love and great adulation for my friends and my time when I was living in Humboldt. I lived in Arcata, California for 5 years. It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful area that I have a lot of great memories from, and really kind of started my label there. I started really booking shows there. A lot of stuff. I got a degree in journalism from Humboldt State University there, and made a lot of lasting friendships. I was one of the very few people from the East Coast there. So yeah, it was a great time, and Michelle was a big part of that. So I want to thank her again. And listen, you guys tune in the first Wednesday of this coming year in 2017. I'm going to come back with an all new season of the House List, premiering with another great conversation with Michelle Cable. You can please subscribe on iTunes. You can also catch it on the Stitcher app or SoundCloud if you need alternatives to that. Otherwise, I just want to tell you guys that I love you and I appreciate everything. I'm very grateful and have a lot of gratitude that I want to express to everybody. So yes, thank you, and be safe and take care, y'all. All right, I'm out of here.